How did medieval shepherds manage to sleep through freezing nights while storms drenched the hillsides and snow or frost coated the grass underfoot? For those who tended flocks in the remote uplands of medieval Europe, comfort was a rare luxury, and warmth was a matter of survival rather than convenience. These shepherds lived lives dictated by the seasons, the weather, and the unpredictable movements of their sheep, goats, or cattle. They were constantly exposed to elements that could be unforgiving, from torrential rains in autumn to biting winter winds that whipped across empty pastures. Yet, through a combination of practical ingenuity, careful preparation, and intimate knowledge of the land, they found ways to endure these extreme conditions. Understanding how they slept through such nights requires a close look at the materials they used, the shelters they improvised, and the strategies that allowed their bodies to retain heat. Medieval shepherds rarely had permanent buildings on the hillsides. The high pastures were often far from villages, and traveling back and forth to sleep in a stable or cottage was impractical. Instead, they relied on temporary shelters, often little more than tents, lean-tos, or windbreaks constructed from wood, turf, and brush. Some regions offered natural protection in the form of rock outcrops, caves, or dense groves of trees, which shepherds would use to shield themselves from the worst of the wind and rain. They understood the principle of microclimates, seeking depressions in the terrain where cold air would drain away, leaving slightly warmer pockets at ground level. Knowledge of prevailing wind patterns was essential. By placing their shelters on the leeward side of hills or behind ridges, they could drastically reduce exposure to cutting gales and driving rain. The materials available to them were simple but effective. Wool, both raw and woven into blankets, was a primary insulator. Sheep's wool had been valued for centuries not only for clothing but also for bedding, because its crimped fibers trap air and retain warmth even when damp. Shepherds often layered thick woolen garments with fur pelts, creating a combination of insulation and windproofing. They would sometimes line their makeshift beds with dry grasses, rushes, or straw, which provided both cushioning and an additional insulating layer between their bodies and the cold, wet ground. Layering was not haphazard. Experienced shepherds knew how to build up barriers that trapped body heat while allowing moisture to escape. They learned to balance warmth with breathability, understanding that a too tightly enclosed space could become clammy and uncomfortable, reducing its insulating properties. Fire played a crucial, though limited, role in their survival. In regions where open flames were permitted on the hillsides, shepherds would construct small, contained fires near their shelters. These fires served several purposes. They offered immediate warmth, they helped to dry damp clothing or bedding, and they could be used to cook simple meals that provided the caloric fuel necessary to maintain body heat. However, fires were not always safe or practical. High winds could spread embers, and smoke could reveal the shepherd's location to others, including thieves or predators. Therefore, fire was often a carefully managed resource, used sparingly and only in the safest conditions. In its absence, other methods became more critical. Shepherds relied heavily on the principle of insulation from both the ground and the air. They would often construct raised sleeping platforms from logs, stones, or bundles of brush, elevating themselves above the wet earth. In colder months, they might dig shallow depressions in the soil and line them with layers of straw or moss, creating a rudimentary but surprisingly effective insulating bed. Clothing also followed a similar logic. Multiple layers trapped air close to the body, while outer garments made from wool or treated leather provided protection from rain and wind. Caps, mittens, and leg wrappings were not merely accessories. They were essential components of a system designed to minimize heat loss. Even small details, such as tucking sleeves and trousers into boots or rolling up collars to shield the neck, made measurable differences in overall warmth. Diet and body condition were intimately linked to endurance. Shepherds understood that warmth came not only from clothing but from the metabolic heat generated by their bodies. A diet rich in protein and fat was crucial. Cured meats, cheese, and grains were staples that could be carried in a small pouch and eaten on the move. In harsh conditions, the body burns calories at an accelerated rate to maintain core temperature, so a shepherd who underestimated the energy demands of a stormy night could find himself succumbing to cold more quickly than expected. Morning routines often began with stoking a small fire, eating a warm meal, and moving actively to restore circulation before facing another day tending the flock. Beyond the practical aspects of warmth, medieval shepherds cultivated behaviors that enhanced their survival. They learned to recognize the signs of hypothermia and frostbite and adjusted their routines accordingly. For example, a shepherd might stay awake for part of the night, rotating his position to maintain blood flow and prevent certain limbs from freezing. Companionship even among animals could play a role. Sheep and goats often huddled together, sharing body heat, and shepherds would take advantage of these natural patterns by placing themselves near the densest part of the flock. The simple act of staying close to the animals they tended provided both physical warmth and psychological reassurance, reinforcing their vigilance against both environmental and predatory threats. The architecture of temporary shelters reflected a deep understanding of seasonal changes. In summer, when rain was sporadic and temperatures higher, minimal shelter sufficed. A simple lean-to covered with turf or a canvas-like material provided protection from sudden showers. In winter or during prolonged wet periods, more substantial constructions were necessary. Shepherds sometimes built small huts with sod walls or stone bases, topped with thatched roofs or layers of brush and turf. These structures were not permanent dwellings in the sense of village homes, but they could last long enough to endure a season and offered a remarkable degree of protection against the elements. The interiors were designed to minimize drafts and maximize retained heat. Entrances were often narrow and low, reducing the loss of warm air, while walls were thick enough to buffer the cold winds. Shepherds also relied on observational knowledge of their environment to choose optimal sleeping sites. Snow-covered slopes, frozen streams, or exposed ridges were avoided when possible, while sheltered hollows, forested patches, and sun-facing inclines were preferred. They understood that even a slight rise in elevation could catch more wind, while a small depression might trap cold air. These micro-decisions could mean the difference between a tolerable night and one that threatened frostbite or illness. In areas where storms were frequent, shepherds might construct multiple shelters along a pasture, allowing for rotation and adjustment based on changing weather patterns. This flexibility was essential in landscapes where sudden shifts in conditions were common. In addition to environmental adaptations, medieval shepherds developed routines that maximized warmth through social and physical strategies. When several shepherds tended the same flock, they might sleep in proximity, sharing shelters or huddling near a fire. Collective experience allowed them to teach each other survival techniques, from optimal layering of clothing to emergency shelter construction, even solo. Shepherds cultivated skills for improvisation, knowing how to use a fallen tree, a rock pile, or a dense bush as part of a windbreak, or to construct a crude bed platform. Their resilience was a combination of instinct, learned knowledge, and a profound connection to the natural rhythms of their surroundings. Medical remedies and traditional practices also played a role. They carried knowledge of herbs and natural salves that could treat chilblains, frostbite, and minor injuries, all of which were common in prolonged exposure to cold and wet conditions. Warm compresses, hot stones wrapped in cloth, and small fires were used to restore circulation. Shepherds understood that managing small injuries and maintaining overall health was crucial. A simple frostbite could incapacitate a lone shepherd in the middle of a hillside with potentially fatal consequences. These practices illustrate a holistic approach to survival, blending physical preparations with ongoing vigilance and a practical understanding of physiology. Ultimately, sleeping warm in the medieval hills was less about comfort and more about survival strategy. It was an intricate interplay of materials, shelter design, diet, clothing, environmental awareness, and personal discipline. Every choice, from the placement of a temporary hut to the layering of woolen garments, had immediate consequences for health and endurance. These shepherds lived lives intimately tied to the elements, developing expertise that allowed them to exist, if not thrive, in some of the harshest climates of medieval Europe. Their solutions, simple by modern standards, demonstrate a remarkable ability to adapt and innovate, relying on keen observation, hands-on experience, and an understanding of the natural world that was both practical and essential. Winter in the hills demanded that shepherds refine their strategies beyond mere shelter and clothing. As snow deepened and winds intensified, they relied on routines honed through years of experience to maintain body heat and stave off exhaustion. The first step was preparation before nightfall. Evening chores involved more than securing the flock. Shepherds would gather dry grasses, moss, and brush to reinforce bedding and insulate sleeping areas. They often carried small bundles of these materials in a sack, replenishing damp or compressed layers each night. Even a few centimeters of fresh, dry straw could significantly reduce heat loss to the frozen ground. When available, they added layers of animal skins, often sheep or goat pelts, arranging them so the thick wool faced upward to trap air, while the smoother leather side touched the bedding surface, creating a barrier against moisture. Beyond bedding, maintaining warmth required careful attention to body activity. Shepherds would finish evening rounds with brisk movement, often chasing the flock from one corner of the pasture to another to raise circulation. This not only ensured that the animals stayed safe, but also preheated the body for the night. Before settling down, they removed wet outer garments to prevent heat loss and replaced them with dry layers. A simple change from a damp woolen coat to a dry one could be the difference between tolerable sleep and hypothermic danger. For added protection, some shepherds created rudimentary sleeping sacks from sewn-together skins or heavy wool designed to envelop the body almost entirely. Inside these sacks, heat was retained efficiently, and the layered structure allowed moisture from breath or sweat to escape, reducing chilling condensation. Fire, when possible, continued to play a pivotal role in winter survival. Shepherds learned to build small, manageable hearths near their shelters, using stones to contain flames and prevent embers from spreading. These fires were not only a source of heat, but also a method for warming stones that could later serve as radiators through the night. Heated rocks were wrapped in cloth or animal skins and placed in sleeping areas to release gentle warmth over several hours. This practice was particularly valuable in regions where frost penetrated even the thickest bedding. Shepherds were careful to manage the risks, keeping flammable materials at a safe distance while ensuring smoke could ventilate to avoid suffocation. The combination of fire, heated stones, and insulating layers created an environment where even in sub-zero temperatures, a shepherd could survive several hours of sleep without succumbing to cold. Diet and caloric intake were equally crucial. In winter, the body required significantly more energy to maintain core temperature. Shepherds carried compact, high-calorie foods such as dried meats, cheese, nuts, and dense bread. Meals were often eaten in stages, a small portion before bed to provide immediate energy for warmth, and a larger meal in the evening before the night's rounds. Fat-rich foods were particularly important because the body metabolizes fat slowly, generating sustained heat throughout the night. Hot drinks made from water, grain, or herbs were sometimes available, and even a small cup of warm liquid could raise internal temperature and morale. For those tending livestock alone, rationing food carefully was a survival skill, ensuring energy supplies lasted for weeks of harsh conditions. Physical proximity to the flock offered both practical and thermal advantages. Sheep and goats naturally huddled together for warmth, and shepherds took advantage of this instinct. Sleeping near or partially within the flock's enclosure allowed the animal's body heat to radiate into the surrounding space. In some instances, shepherds would drape a pelt over a portion of the enclosure wall, creating a microenvironment warmed by the combined heat of humans and animals. This method not only reduced heat loss, but also provided a psychological sense of security in otherwise exposed landscapes. Even when isolated, shepherds used these principles, piling hay or straw against fences or trees to form windbreaks that captured residual warmth from both animals and the earth. Shelter construction evolved according to seasonal demands. In mild weather, lean-tos and simple brush huts sufficed, but the onset of snow and sleet required more elaborate structures. Shepherds used sod, turf, and brush to build insulated walls, sometimes doubling layers to trap air and block wind. Roofs were fashioned from thatch, additional turf, or bundled brush, angled steeply to shed rain and snow. Entrances were deliberately small to retain heat, often covered with a flap of hide or thick cloth to block drafts. Inside, the floor was raised on logs, rocks, or compacted brush, reducing direct contact with frozen ground. In harsher regions, shallow trenches lined with moss or straw were dug, forming a bed-like depression where a shepherd could sleep partially enclosed by earth walls, further enhancing insulation. Clothing remained a critical factor in maintaining warmth. Multiple layers, each with a specific function, were standard practice. Linen undergarments provided a base that absorbed minimal moisture, while woolen garments trapped air and created insulation. Outer layers of thick wool or treated leather offered windproofing and partial waterproofing. Accessories such as caps, mittens, and leg wraps minimized heat loss from extremities, where blood flow was most vulnerable to cold-induced constriction. Experienced shepherds knew the importance of covering the neck and face, sometimes fashioning simple masks or scarves from wool to shield skin against frostbite. Attention to detail extended to footwear. Boots were reinforced with straw or moss, which absorbed sweat while adding insulation, keeping feet warmer throughout long, cold nights. The weather itself dictated strategy. Shepherds were adept at reading subtle environmental cues. Changes in cloud patterns, wind direction, or animal behavior indicated approaching storms. In anticipation, they would reinforce shelters, adjust bedding, and ensure firewood and dry material were accessible. Snow accumulation was carefully monitored. Excessive snow could collapse light brush structures, while frost alone required additional insulation but allowed for continued mobility. Shepherds learned to rotate sleeping sites, sometimes moving between natural shelters, elevated platforms, or constructed huts to take advantage of wind shadows, sun exposure, or dry ground. This flexibility was key in regions where conditions could change dramatically within hours. Even under the harshest circumstances, medieval shepherds developed methods to regulate moisture and prevent chilling. Wool, while insulating, could become heavy when soaked, so layers were strategically managed. Outer garments were often removed before sleep if wet, replaced with dry layers, while bedding was adjusted to absorb any residual dampness. Straw, moss, or grasses were replaced regularly, and clothing was aired whenever possible during daylight hours. Shepherds understood that prolonged contact with moisture could rapidly decrease body temperature even in relatively mild conditions. Attention to drying, layering, and separation of wet and dry materials was as essential as the construction of shelters themselves. Mental resilience was as important as physical measures. Long nights on frozen hillsides were isolating and demanding. Shepherds developed routines to maintain focus and alertness, often staying partially awake to monitor both the flock and environmental conditions. Knowledge of seasonal patterns, animal behavior, and personal limits was critical to maintaining confidence. The psychological aspect of warmth, staying calm, conserving energy, and maintaining awareness was integral to survival. Panic or overexertion could lead to increased sweat and subsequent chilling, while careful, measured actions enhanced warmth retention. The integration of all these practices demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of survival under extreme conditions. From the careful selection of sleeping sites and construction of insulated shelters to the meticulous management of clothing, bedding, and fire, medieval shepherds combined practical skill with an intimate knowledge of the natural world. Their lives were defined by cycles of preparation, adaptation, and vigilance, each season bringing new challenges and requiring new strategies. Even in isolation, they had developed a toolkit of methods that ensured survival in landscapes where exposure to cold and rain could easily be fatal. Shepherds' experiences reveal a balance between improvisation and tradition. While individual ingenuity was valued, many techniques were passed down through generations, refined over decades to suit local climates and terrain. Young shepherds learned by observing older, experienced caretakers how to build a windbreak, how to layer clothing effectively, how to recognize signs of hypothermia, and how to ration food for prolonged winter periods. Knowledge of plant materials, animal behavior, and weather patterns was systematically integrated into daily routines. This collective wisdom created a culture of survival that was both practical and adaptable, ensuring that even in the coldest, wettest conditions, shepherds could endure through the night. Ultimately, the survival strategies of medieval shepherds illustrate a harmonious interplay between environment, technology, and human ingenuity. Each component, shelter, bedding, clothing, diet, movement, and observation, was part of a carefully calibrated system designed to preserve warmth and life. Despite the absence of modern conveniences, these individuals demonstrated an extraordinary ability to adapt to their surroundings, using available resources to create conditions that allowed sleep, recovery, and continued vigilance over their flocks. Their expertise reflects a deep understanding of both the natural world and the limits of human endurance, a testament to the resilience required to thrive in medieval upland landscapes. As winter deepened and snow blanketed the hills, medieval shepherds relied on long-term strategies to maintain warmth and survival. Their practices extended beyond the immediate needs of a single night, encompassing seasonal planning, resource management, and continuous adaptation to weather extremes. Shepherds prepared months in advance, storing dried food, extra bedding materials, and firewood in accessible caches. These reserves were carefully rationed, accounting for both human consumption and the occasional need to feed animals when pastures were buried under ice or snow. In many regions, shepherds would anticipate the harshest periods of winter, constructing or reinforcing temporary shelters and ensuring that essential tools, knives, small axes, flints, and cordage, were within reach, ready for rapid repairs or adjustments. This foresight was not optional. Without preparation, a sudden storm or prolonged freeze could prove catastrophic. Proximity to animals continued to be central to survival. Shepherds understood that their flocks were not just a source of livelihood, but also a living source of warmth. By positioning sleeping areas adjacent to the densest parts of the flock's enclosure, shepherds maximized the benefits of radiated body heat. In extreme cold, it was common to partially incorporate hay or straw stacks into sleeping platforms, forming insulating walls that further trapped warmth from both human and animal bodies. The layout of shelters reflected careful thought. Windward sides were solidly built to block gusts, while leeward areas were left open just enough to allow airflow and prevent smoke from fires from becoming suffocating. This balance between ventilation and insulation was crucial, especially when sleeping near heated stones or embers. During prolonged storms, shepherds were forced to improvise continuously. Flooded hollows were avoided, and snow-laden paths required relocation of both human and animal positions. Improvisation drew on deep knowledge of local topography, vegetation, and seasonal patterns. Even small details, such as layering wet brush on top of a lean-to shed snow while keeping it from soaking the inner layers, contributed to survival. Shepherds learned to read subtle changes in temperature and wind, moving bedding or reinforcing walls before conditions became critical. The margin between safety and exposure was narrow, and vigilance through the night often determined whether a shepherd would endure or succumb to hypothermia. Food and drink remained integral to endurance. Shepherds consumed high-calorie rations that supported sustained body heat. Fat-rich foods such as cured meats, cheese, and nuts were staples, sometimes supplemented by grains and dried fruits. Water sources were monitored carefully. In frozen conditions, melted snow or ice served as both hydration and a means to prepare warm drinks when heated stones were available. Even small amounts of warm liquid could significantly increase internal body temperature, particularly during the coldest hours before dawn. The rhythm of meals was intertwined with work. Evening portions provided immediate warmth for nighttime, while daytime feeding replenished energy for shepherding duties. Proper nutrition allowed metabolic heat to complement insulation from clothing and shelter, creating a layered defense against the cold. The clothing system of medieval shepherds was a testament to functional design. Layering continued to be refined according to both the weather and the type of activity. The base layer absorbed minimal moisture while wicking sweat away, the middle layers provided insulation, and the outer layers shielded from wind and rain. Fur-lined caps, mittens, and leg wraps minimized heat loss from extremities, while scarves and collars protected the neck and face. Boots were reinforced with moss or straw to prevent conduction of cold from the frozen ground. These clothing practices were dynamic. Wet layers were removed and dried when possible, and dry layers were rotated to maintain warmth. The careful balance of insulation, breathability, and moisture management allowed shepherds to survive conditions that would otherwise quickly sap energy and body heat. Shepherds also developed mental strategies to endure long nights of isolation. Vigilance was necessary both to protect the flock and to monitor personal warmth. Sleep was often segmented with periods of wakefulness to stir circulation and check for threats. Routine, discipline, and attentiveness reduced panic, which could lead to excessive sweating and rapid chilling. Shepherds practiced controlled movement within shelters and temporary structures to maintain blood flow while conserving energy for critical periods of labor or emergency response. They relied on observation of their surroundings, reading snow accumulation, wind shifts, and animal behavior as guides to both short-term and long-term survival strategies. Adaptation extended to the construction and maintenance of shelters. Winter huts, often made of sod, brush, or stone, were maintained with continual adjustments. Snow buildup on roofs was cleared to prevent collapse, while new layers of moss or straw were added to reinforce insulation. Leeward sides of structures were strengthened against shifting winds, and small adjustable openings allowed smoke from heated stones or small fires to escape safely. Even in temporary lean-tos, layering and reinforcement were key. A simple structure could be transformed into a semi-permanent shelter capable of withstanding prolonged storms. Knowledge of local materials, types of grass, moss, or bark suitable for insulation, was passed down through generations, ensuring that even the youngest shepherds could construct adequate protection in challenging conditions. Hygiene and moisture management were crucial, particularly during long stretches of wet weather. Sleeping surfaces, clothing, and bedding required constant attention. Wet materials were replaced, and clothing was aired whenever sunlight permitted. Straw or moss under bedding was replaced regularly to prevent compression and dampness, maintaining its insulating properties. Shepherds recognized that prolonged exposure to moisture could drastically increase the risk of frostbite and illness, even when other layers were adequate. Attention to these details was as much a survival strategy as fire, insulation, or diet, ensuring that every component of warmth and protection functioned effectively together. Shepherds' knowledge extended beyond immediate survival to seasonal preparation and resource management. Winter was anticipated in autumn, when materials could be gathered and shelters reinforced. Flocks were rotated to ensure grazing in more sheltered areas, and extra feed was stockpiled to prevent reliance on frozen pastures. Winter storms were tracked and observed over years, giving shepherds the ability to predict patterns and prepare in advance. This long-term perspective allowed for adjustments in shelter, bedding, clothing, and rationing, demonstrating a strategic approach to survival rather than reliance on reactive measures alone. Even in extreme isolation, the social aspect of shepherding contributed indirectly to survival. Knowledge was shared through apprenticeship, storytelling, and communal observation of flock behavior. Techniques for layering clothing, constructing shelters, and managing fire were passed down, refined, and adapted to local conditions. Collective memory and practical instruction allowed inexperienced shepherds to survive alongside veterans who had endured decades of harsh winters. This transmission of knowledge created a resilient culture, ensuring that each generation could meet the challenges of the hillsides with increasing effectiveness. Predation and natural threats were constant considerations. Wolves, wild dogs, and other predators were drawn to both livestock and solitary humans. Shepherds took precautions, constructing protective barriers, maintaining vigilance, and positioning themselves strategically within the flock. Even in sleep, proximity to the densest part of the flock offered both warmth and a defensive advantage. The physical and behavioral adaptations to environmental threats were intertwined with the methods for retaining warmth. Huddling close to animals, constructing sturdy shelters, and maintaining alertness were part of a comprehensive survival system that balanced exposure, safety, and comfort. The resilience of medieval shepherds lay in the integration of multiple survival strategies. Clothing, shelter, diet, fire, animal behavior, and environmental awareness functioned as a coordinated system rather than independent elements. Each aspect complemented the others, producing a combined effect that allowed humans to endure conditions that would otherwise be lethal. The lessons of layered insulation, heat retention, moisture management, and proactive observation reflect a sophisticated understanding of both physiology and the natural environment. Even without modern materials or technology, shepherds maximized what was available to create effective, adaptable solutions. By the end of winter, shepherds had survived months of exposure, relying on knowledge, skill, and careful planning. The rhythm of the hills dictated daily routines, from tending the flock to reinforcing shelters, from rationing food to maintaining personal warmth. Despite the hardships, these individuals developed a profound understanding of their environment, an intuitive sense of timing, and the ability to improvise under pressure. Their practices ensured survival not only for themselves, but also for the flocks they protected, sustaining livelihoods through the most challenging seasons. The ingenuity and resilience of medieval shepherds offer a remarkable window into human adaptation. Their methods demonstrate how practical knowledge, careful observation, and continuous adjustment can overcome extreme environmental challenges. Each layer of clothing, each straw-filled bedding platform, each small fire, and every strategic choice of shelter exemplifies a cumulative wisdom built over generations. Their survival was a delicate balance of preparation, observation, and improvisation, a holistic approach that integrated physical, psychological, and environmental factors into a coherent strategy. Ultimately, the story of these shepherds is a testament to endurance and human ingenuity. The cold hillsides, the driving rain, the relentless winds, and the frozen nights were obstacles that demanded constant attention, careful planning, and practical skill. Through experience and knowledge, medieval shepherds developed survival techniques that ensured warmth, sustenance, and safety, allowing them to persist in environments that tested the limits of human resilience. Their legacy is one of adaptation, resourcefulness, and a deep connection to the land, reflecting a profound understanding of both the natural world and the human capacity to endure within it.